The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and the polished brass doors of the Summit Crown Hotel swung open with a soft, almost reverent hum. It was just another day, but the air in the lobby seemed to hum with a quiet arrogance, a sense of exclusivity, of privilege. The guests, dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, moved with purpose, their heads held high, each one seemingly more perfect than the last. The hotel was a kingdom, and every single person in this space belonged. Except for Malcolm Reed. He stepped through those doors with the ease of someone who knew exactly what was coming. Gray jacket, clean sneakers, a nondescript black leather bag slung over his shoulder. His clothes weren't flashy. There was no designer tag to scream about wealth, no gaudy accessories to announce his status. He didn't need them. His presence was enough. The eyes of the room shifted in his direction, but only for a moment. Some guests barely noticed him. Others lingered just a bit too long, wondering if he belonged, if he was perhaps a mistake in their world of opulence. Staff exchanged silent glances, the first subtle signs of judgment. Malcolm knew the game. He'd played it 100 times before.
Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. He walked with purpose, each step as steady as the last. His presence didn't demand attention, but it commanded something deeper, a quiet assurance that only those who had fought their way into spaces they weren't wanted understood. He knew exactly what they were thinking. He'd seen it all before. Another one who thinks they belong. Another one they're going to underestimate. But I know how to play this game. They just don't know it yet. There was no anger in his thoughts, only cold calculation, a mental checklist of how this would unfold. His body was relaxed, his posture open, as if he was walking into a room he had every right to be in. And in the back of his mind, he knew that today he would show them. This wasn't a hotel lobby, it was a battlefield, and he was about to win. Malcolm approached the front desk, the polished wood gleaming under the soft light. It was a far cry from the quiet, understated luxury of his usual haunts. The Summit Crown was a different breed of place altogether, a spectacle. He couldn't deny the power it had in its presence. People felt it. And he, too, had once felt the weight of it, had been drawn to the allure of it. But now, as he stood in front of the desk, he knew the game they were playing. They just didn't know it yet. Sophie Lang, the front desk clerk, was the first to make him feel the coldness of their world. She glanced up from her tablet, her eyes flicking from his sneakers to his jacket, her lip curling ever so slightly. The smirk that tugged at the corner of her mouth was barely perceptible, but it was there. The type of smile that said, "I know you don't belong here." Without missing a beat, Sophie reached for the reservation list, flicking her pen absently, deliberately ignoring him as she scanned the screen. Her gaze avoided his, as if she were somehow too important to acknowledge someone like him. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, almost as if she was bored. And that boredom made it clear he was the anomaly here, the interruption. The casual observer might have missed it, the small, almost imperceptible gestures that spoke volumes, but Malcolm felt every single one. Her fingers hovered over the screen, a beat too long. And then, without ever lifting her eyes to meet his, she asked, her voice dripping with patronizing politeness, "Can I help you?" The tone wasn't inquisitive. It wasn't welcoming. It was a question you ask a child who's wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. It was as though she were saying, "What are you doing here?" with every syllable. Malcolm didn't flinch. He kept his eyes steady, never once allowing his discomfort to show. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing how she'd gotten under his skin. This is how it starts, he thought, the quiet dismissal, the assumption that he didn't belong here. But he had been down this road so many times. This was the game. They think I'm invisible. They think I don't belong. But in the midst of it all, something inside Malcolm clicked. He had seen worse, far worse, in boardrooms where his ideas were dismissed, not because they were bad, but because they were coming from someone who didn't look like he belonged there. In meetings where his voice was drowned out by the hum of silent prejudice, where the disrespect wasn't loud, but just there. Malcolm stood still, his expression calm, his gaze unwavering. But inside, a part of him was reliving those moments, every insult that had been silently hurled at him over the years. Yet he wouldn't react. Not today. Not now. Today he wasn't here to show them his anger. He was here to show them his power. He stayed silent as Sophie glanced up at him briefly, her eyes narrowing as she found his name on the screen. I could tell she was trying to place him, trying to figure out whether he was a guest who'd mistakenly wandered into a world he didn't belong to, or someone worthy of respect. Her eyes flickered for just a second, long enough to catch the slightest flicker of realization. Maybe she knew then. Maybe she didn't. But that fleeting moment wasn't enough to break the wall she'd put up. She didn't know how to handle him. Not yet. The sigh she gave, as though she were tolerating a chore, was her final insult. She handed him the key, almost tossing it in his direction, and didn't meet his gaze again as she spoke. Her words felt like nothing more than a formality. "Enjoy your stay, sir." Malcolm didn't need to respond. He had already won, not in the sense of gaining a key to a room or a formal apology. No. He had already taken control of this moment, in the way he carried himself, in the way he didn't flinch, in the way he showed them that their dismissal meant nothing. His dignity wasn't for them to decide. His mind flashed to 100 other moments like this, moments where he had been treated as less than, not because of what he had done, but because of how he looked. This time, it was different. Malcolm turned without a word and walked toward the elevators, his steps measured. The tense silence behind him didn't faze him. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't need their approval. He knew who he was, and that was more than enough. "I've been through worse." He said it quietly, but it echoed through him, the weight of it grounding him as he moved through the hotel, a hotel that didn't yet know the power he was about to reveal. The tension in the air thickened as Sophie, with that same cold precision, stared at the screen in front of her. Her fingers hesitated for just a moment, lingering on the keys, before she pulled the reservation up again with the same casual indifference. She glanced at him, only for a brief second before her gaze darted back to the screen, as if pretending he wasn't even there.
"There seems to be a mistake," she said, the words barely rising above a murmur. Her tone wasn't questioning, but dismissive, as though her own judgment was the final word. "Your reservation isn't showing up for the penthouse." There it was, the moment of humiliation. The words were soft, but their sting was sharp. It was the subtle dismissal, the kind of thing that doesn't seem so bad at first, but cuts deep when you realize what's happening. Malcolm felt the shift, but he didn't react. He wouldn't. He knew what she was doing. He'd felt it before, and he wasn't going to let it unravel him now. The cool air in the lobby seemed to grow even more unwelcoming. Sophie's eyes flicked away from him, making no attempt to hold eye contact. It was a quiet but potent gesture. Her silence now spoke volumes. She wasn't just doubting his reservation, she was doubting his very right to be there. She wasn't just questioning his status, she was putting him in his place. Around him, the guests began to notice. There were the usual subtle glances, those sideways stares that people try to make look casual. But it wasn't casual. It was discomfort seeping out, like an itch no one could quite scratch. It was the quiet recognition that something was happening that shouldn't be. Some guests shifted in their seats, awkwardly adjusting themselves as if they could somehow distance themselves from the discomfort Malcolm felt. The whispers began slowly, like a ripple spreading across a calm surface. Some of the guests were trying to make sense of what was happening, while others felt the weight of judgment in the air. The hushed voices had a rhythm to them, subtle yet persistent, and Malcolm could hear the odd, stifled chuckles and murmurs of confusion that buzzed like flies in the background. Some people were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but others were simply curious, fascinated by the strange turn of events.
The situation was spiraling into an uncomfortable limbo, and for a brief second, Malcolm felt the burn of humiliation creep in. It was a quiet kind of disrespect, the type that's so small, so hidden in plain sight that you can't even explain it. He could feel the weight of the room's judgment, the weight of everyone assuming he didn't belong here. But something shifted in Malcolm. As Sophie continued to tap away at her screen, pretending that she had all the time in the world to sort out the details, he could feel the building tension press in around him, like the walls of the hotel were closing in. He could hear the whispers grow louder, the murmurs becoming more distinct, yet he didn't flinch. They think I'm invisible. They think I don't matter. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't the first time he'd been treated like this. This wasn't the first time he'd been made to feel like he wasn't good enough, like he was an imposter in spaces that should have been his. Yet this moment felt different. He felt something shift. Malcolm realized that the game had changed. It wasn't about trying to fight for respect anymore. He was beyond that. He was beyond the quiet whispers, beyond the sidelong glances. He was no longer the one who had to prove his worth. The real shift was in him. He wasn't going to let them control the narrative anymore. Sophie's voice, once so confident and dismissive, now felt like a faint echo in his mind. It was so soft, so insistent, almost as if she was trying to cover up the discomfort in her own voice, the unspoken recognition that something was amiss.
"I'm afraid the penthouse is unavailable, sir. Perhaps we could offer you something more modest?" The offer was a slap, dressed in the finest politeness, a not-so-subtle suggestion that he wasn't worthy of the same room as those around him. The humiliation was laid bare now. It was an insult wrapped in a perfectly wrapped bow of concern, a thinly veiled mockery. Malcolm's mind raced, but his face remained perfectly still. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room trained on him, could sense the shift in the atmosphere, a quiet, collective realization that the person they were watching wasn't some ordinary guest, not someone to be dismissed. But Malcolm didn't react. His lips didn't twitch, his fingers didn't clench. He remained calm, still, in control. Inside, however, a fire burned quietly. This isn't just about me, he thought. This is about every moment I've had to fight for my place, every time I've been overlooked, disregarded, assumed to be something I'm not. This ends today. Malcolm's thoughts sharpened. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He wasn't going to break, wasn't going to be humiliated again. This wasn't just a hotel lobby. This wasn't just a moment of being dismissed. This was the beginning of something bigger. As Sophie handed him the key, almost tossing it in his direction, he took it with unwavering calm, the weight of it mildly heavy in his hand. The moment, the humiliation, the dismissal, none of it mattered anymore.
Because in that split second, Malcolm realized that he was in control. And Sophie? She didn't know yet, but she was about to find out just how much he belonged. Not in her hotel, but in the world he was about to command. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his steps steady, unbothered by the whispered judgments still hanging in the air. The game had begun. The tension in the lobby thickened like the stillness before a storm. Every breath held, as if the building itself were waiting for something to give. Malcolm stood motionless, as though the world around him had frozen. His gaze was steady, locked onto the front desk where Sophie continued to fidget with the reservation system, her actions growing more frantic with each passing second. It was as if time had stretched itself thin, drawn out and elongated by the quiet but undeniable power Malcolm radiated in that moment. Around him, the air grew heavy. Guests shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking nervously between the escalating interaction and each other. The whispers had grown more distinct, the judgment clear in their words. Some of the guests were uncomfortable, others curious, but all felt the undeniable shift in the room's atmosphere. Carl Benson, the security guard, slowly made his way toward the front desk. His gait was deliberate, controlled, meant to project an image of authority. His eyes narrowed, scanning Malcolm from head to toe as though he were a potential threat. There was no hurry in his steps, no urgency. He didn't need to move fast. He was the embodiment of unquestioned power in this space, and Malcolm's presence was now the challenge he had to neutralize.
Malcolm didn't budge. His posture remained open, calm, almost effortless. There was a subtle shift in the air as Carl closed the distance between them, but Malcolm didn't flinch. His expression didn't waver. Eyes unwaveringly focused, his body unbothered by the presence of the guard. Carl's approach was a dance. He was walking toward a man he didn't understand, one who refused to conform to the social rules he was accustomed to enforcing. Carl's instincts told him to act, to remove the discomfort from the hotel by forcing it back into place, but he didn't know how to handle this type of situation. Malcolm was unlike anyone he had encountered. He was a stranger to the rules, a figure who had slipped through the cracks, and it confused Carl more than it frustrated him. As Carl stood a few feet away, the weight of the situation was palpable. The invisible thread that connected the two men had tightened, taut like a bowstring ready to snap. The rest of the world for a split second ceased to exist. The lobby seemed to silence itself in anticipation, holding its breath. Carl's eyes never left Malcolm's, but Malcolm, his face a study in perfect composure, didn't blink. This was the moment that would define the rest of the interaction. The hotel, the staff, the guests, they were all waiting to see how it would unfold. Would Malcolm cower, intimidated by the macho authority of the security guard? Or would he stand his ground and reveal something much larger? His silent defiance spoke louder than words, leaving everyone in the room with a sense of unease. For a split second, Carl hesitated, his jaw tightening, but his gaze softened with uncertainty. This man, this guest, was not just anyone. There was something off about him, something he couldn't quite place. Carl wasn't sure what he was dealing with. There was no aggression in Malcolm's stance, no resistance to authority, but there was also no submission, no expectation of the usual process. The balance was fragile. Carl had never encountered someone like this before. He didn't know what to do with him. Malcolm's thoughts, calm as ever, were a stark contrast to the growing tension around him. This isn't just about me, he thought. This is bigger than the hotel, bigger than their assumption that I don't belong here. They don't know it yet, but this moment is mine to control. Carl stepped closer, his hand resting on the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. He was trying to appear calm, but there was something tangible in the way he held himself. He wasn't quite sure if he should assert dominance or wait for something to happen. His body tensed as he watched Malcolm, waiting for any sign of defiance, any indication that this man would make the first move. But Malcolm never moved. He stood there, still,
composed, a man who had learned not to react to the small humiliations of life, the ones that most people would lash out at, the ones that would make them break down and fight. Malcolm had learned to hold his ground in silence. The lack of a response from him only deepened the discomfort of the situation. Carl's grip tightened on the walkie-talkie, but he didn't speak. He was waiting for something, an order, a reason to escalate.
He's waiting for me to react, Malcolm thought. But I've been trained in silence. My power doesn't come from words, it comes from control. It comes from knowing exactly how far I can push without breaking. And they'll push first. And in that moment, Carl's hesitation gave Malcolm all the leverage he needed. The room grew heavier with each second. Every passing moment seemed to stretch into eternity, like a high-stakes game of chess. Neither man moved. The lobby held its breath. Then, just as the tension was about to snap, Sophie cleared her throat and spoke, her voice suddenly breaking the silence. "Sir, if you don't mind, I'll have to ask you to step aside." But Malcolm didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Carl's, and he said nothing. The camera lingered on Malcolm's calm face, his composure somehow more intimidating than any raised voice or angry gesture could have been. It was as if he were saying, without uttering a word, that this moment was his. The lobby had quieted, but Malcolm was the storm that had yet to come. Carl shifted his weight slightly, still unsure. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. What would Malcolm do? Would he finally speak? Would he stand tall, or would he let them push him? Would he rise to the challenge, or let this moment define him? Everyone in the room was left waiting, unable to look away, unable to move. The camera focused on Malcolm's unflinching gaze, and then the scene froze. What would he do next? The question hung in the air, unresolved, leaving the entire room suspended in uncertainty.
The hotel lobby stood like a polished fortress of wealth, its polished marble floors gleaming under the weight of unspoken rules, rules about who belonged and who didn't. Guests in tailored suits and elegant gowns moved through the space with a grace that only wealth could afford, their voices low and carefully controlled, every word and gesture designed to uphold the facade of refined superiority. In a place like this, appearances were everything. Power was held in the smallest of details, and Malcolm Reed, standing in his gray jacket and sneakers, eyes steady but calculating, was the anomaly. He had walked through these doors before, but this time was different. He could feel the weight of the hotel pressing down on him, its invisible walls trying to make him feel small, to make him believe that he didn't belong. But Malcolm had long ago learned not to let things like that rattle him. This wasn't the first time someone had looked past him, dismissed him based on his appearance. In fact, he had grown accustomed to it. The truth was, he was used to the judgment, used to being treated like he didn't matter, like he was some sort of shadow walking through the rooms where people with real power resided. But today, he wasn't going to let it slide. Today wasn't just another moment in time where the world got to define him. He was going to define this moment himself. Malcolm had built his life from the ground up, brick by brick, fighting for every inch of ground he stood on. Born into a world where prejudice wasn't a whisper, but a loud, unavoidable scream, he knew how to endure the sting of judgment. He had grown up in a modest house in a neighborhood that was often overlooked by everyone, except those who saw it as a place to avoid. As a child, He was no stranger to being ignored or reduced to something lesser simply because of his skin color.
Yet, even back then, he had known that if he waited long enough, the world would eventually see him. He wasn't just going to accept the way people treated him. He wasn't going to shrink. No, Malcolm had decided he would build something greater than their limited views of him. And so he had. He worked tirelessly, taking every opportunity that came his way, building a fortune from sheer grit and intellect, until one day, he wasn't just a part of the system. He was a force within it. He wasn't an outsider anymore. He had become the insider, the one they all had to reckon with. But even with his success, even with the empire he had built, the world still had a way of undermining him. Even in this hotel, among the grand marble pillars and gold-trimmed chairs, Malcolm was reminded that, in the eyes of some, his success could still be discounted, minimized, or reduced to a mere fluke. That was what was at stake now. The truth of who he was, what he had built, and how he was seen by those who didn't matter. As he stood there in the lobby, the murmurs of judgment rising around him, Malcolm's mind drifted. His thoughts were a tidal wave of memories, moments from his past that he had buried deep but could never quite forget. He saw the face of his high school principal, a man who had dismissed him as just another black student who would amount to nothing. The memory was sharp, the way the principal had looked over his shoulder, refusing to even make eye contact with him. His future wasn't even on the line then. It was already decided. "I don't know why you're bothering with college applications," the principal had said, barely glancing up. "You're never going to get in." That moment had burned itself into his memory. A door slammed shut, but Malcolm had found another way. He didn't walk away, didn't let it define him. Instead, he let that moment of rejection fuel him, made sure to walk through the doors of every opportunity, past every person who dared to tell him no. The flashbacks kept coming, and each one brought a wave of quiet anger. The dining rooms where his suit didn't match the expectation. The meetings where his ideas were silenced simply because they weren't deemed worthy. There had been the business lunches with investors, where their eyes flicked over his face, and their opinions were formed before he had even spoken a word. He could still hear their careless chuckles as they sized him up, as if his worth was bound in the same way his appearance was bound, to assumptions, not reality. But no one had ever seen how relentless he could be, how like water cutting through stone, he had let those rejections roll off him and carved his own path, undeterred by the weight of those who couldn't see beyond the surface. In those moments, he had been humiliated, but that was the fuel. That was what had kept him moving forward. And in this moment, in this hotel, it was the same. The world was trying to define him, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. What they didn't know was that he wasn't just walking into the hotel. He was walking into his destiny. This wasn't a fight for a room key. This wasn't about just one night in the penthouse. This was about every battle he had ever fought to be seen for who he truly was, not who the world tried to tell him he was. The tension stretched taut in the lobby, Malcolm standing still in the face of everything that had ever been thrown his way. The guests shifted uncomfortably as the staff carried on, trying to ignore the undercurrent of conflict in the room. Sophie was pretending to continue her task, but the nervous energy was undeniable. In the back of his mind, Malcolm knew what this was really about. It wasn't about a mistake in the reservation system. It was about who could claim power in this room. "This is how they see me," he thought, "like a man who doesn't belong here. But I know better. They can't see the truth yet, but I'll show them. I'll make them see." This was his moment. This was the culmination of every ounce of energy he had poured into this fight, and it was not about to slip away. Malcolm's mind shifted back to the present as Carl Benson, the security guard, stepped forward. His imposing figure loomed in front of him, but Malcolm didn't flinch. There was a subtle but unmistakable shift in the room as Carl's footsteps echoed through the space. Malcolm remained still, unbothered, while Carl's eyes swept over him, sizing him up. The guard's posture, his slow, deliberate movements, his approach, all of it spoke volumes. He wasn't sure what to make of this guest. Was Malcolm a threat? Was he someone who needed to be put in his place?
But Malcolm didn't move. He stayed still, his body language open, but there was an undeniable tension in the way he held himself, like a coiled spring, ready to strike if necessary. Carl could feel the shift, and so could everyone in the lobby. The guests, now silent, looked on with bated breath. They had all witnessed the subtle confrontation, but now it was clear this was no ordinary guest. This was a man who would not be moved. A man who carried the weight of his past, the weight of every moment of rejection and insult he'd ever faced. And now he was demanding respect. Carl's eyes shifted nervously, but Malcolm remained unyielding. There was no threat in Malcolm's eyes. There was only a quiet, unspoken certainty that this moment would not be wasted. Carl wasn't the one who controlled this scene. The guests knew it, the staff knew it, and deep down, Malcolm knew it too. The power dynamic was already shifting. The question was, how far would Malcolm take it? The sound of the elevator doors sliding open pulled Malcolm back to the present, but the memory lingered like smoke in the air. For a moment his eyes grew distant, almost unfocused, as the weight of the past settled into his bones. The hotel lobby faded away, and for a split second he was back in that old, sterile conference room, a place that smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a place where he had once sat at the end of a long table, the only one who looked like him. He was young then, still building his name, still fighting for that first glimpse of recognition. He remembered the meeting like it was yesterday. He'd been ready, armed with facts, figures, the perfect pitch. He had studied for hours, had rehearsed his words in front of the mirror, mentally preparing for every question. This was his moment, or so he thought.
The table was filled with executives, all of them older, more seasoned, more polished in their tailored suits and sharp smiles, but no one looked at him like they saw him. They barely even acknowledged his presence as he presented his ideas. They shifted their attention elsewhere, speaking over him as though his words were just noise. It wasn't outright rejection. No one yelled, no one insulted him to his face. Instead, they ignored him, like he wasn't even there, like the space he occupied was inconsequential. The subtle dismissals piled up like bricks, each one heavier than the last. And then came the moment, the one he could never forget. It wasn't loud, it wasn't an angry remark. No, this one was far more insidious. He had just finished explaining a new strategy he had been working on for weeks, detailing how it would increase profits and expand their market. The room was silent, expectant. Then, as the chairman, a man with perfectly slicked back hair and a tight-lipped smile, turned to his colleague, Thomas, and with a chuckle said, "We'll take it under advisement, Malcolm, but honestly, I think Thomas has something a little more polished." The words landed like a punch. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, the way his tone shifted, the way everyone else in the room subtly shifted their attention, eyes sliding away from him to Thomas, who was already leaning in with a confident smile. The moment wasn't filled with rage. It was cold, calculated, and dripping with the kind of subtle prejudice that Malcolm had long since come to expect, but never quite get used to. The invisible wall he had to fight through every day, simply because of the color of his skin. The memory twisted in his gut, and he felt that familiar, searing humiliation rise up, threatening to consume him. But Malcolm didn't show it. He didn't react. He stayed silent, as always. He wasn't going to let them see the sting of that remark.
He had excused himself from the meeting, a few polite nods thrown his way. As he stepped out into the hallway, he could feel the weight of their disinterest pressing down on him, suffocating him in that small, sterile space. But instead of retreating, instead of letting the humiliation win, something inside of him hardened. He didn't feel sorry for himself. He didn't rage against them. What he felt was a quiet resolve, a decision that this wasn't about proving anyone wrong. This wasn't about showing them that they were wrong to doubt him. No, this was about proving something much more important. I wasn't here to prove them wrong. I was here to prove that I was worthy, no matter what they said. That moment, that decision, would become the foundation for everything that came after. Because from that point forward, Malcolm didn't fight to be seen. He fought to stay true to himself, to make sure that he didn't lose sight of his own worth, even if the world was determined to overlook him. The path ahead wasn't easy. No one handed him a seat at the table. He fought for every inch, every opportunity. Doors were closed in his face, but that only made him more determined to break them down. Every time someone dismissed him, every time someone tried to pretend like he wasn't good enough, he fought harder, worked longer, and pushed forward with a level of focus that felt almost superhuman at times. There were more meetings, more rejections, more moments where he had to grin and bear it, like the time a senior partner had accidentally forgotten to mention him in a group email about a big deal, the kind of deal that could have changed everything, or the time they had called him into a meeting only to talk over him, not once letting him speak, their condescending smiles a reminder of their dismissal. But Malcolm didn't let it break him. He learned from it. Each slight, each disrespectful comment only fueled his resolve. And when they turned away, when they dismissed him as though he wasn't good enough, he quietly proved them wrong, not with words, not with anger, but with results. He started leading his own projects, building from the ground up, showing them that he wasn't just a guest in their world, he belonged in it. He wasn't just a face they could ignore or dismiss, he was the force that would reshape everything. And now, standing in the lobby of the Summit Crown, those moments, those subtle acts of disrespect, still resonated in Malcolm's mind. They were a part of him now, an armor, a badge of honor for the battles fought and won in silence. Each snub, each marginalization had sharpened him, molded him into someone who could withstand the discomfort of being overlooked even in the most exalted spaces. The power dynamics that had once held him back were now the tools he used to shape his world. And here, in this moment, at this hotel, he was reminded that he wasn't just passing through anymore. He was in control. His past had laid the groundwork for this. Every insult had been fuel. Every moment of being unseen had given him the strength to be seen, to be heard, to be respected.
I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong. I came here to prove that I was worthy, no matter what they said. And as he stood there, in this pristine lobby, surrounded by the very walls of power and wealth that had once excluded him, Malcolm knew that he wasn't just passing through anymore. He had arrived. And now it was time to show them. The door clicked shut behind him, and the soft hum of the hotel's air conditioning filled the room. Malcolm Reed stepped away from the door and moved to the center of the suite. The room was pristine, luxurious even, but he barely noticed the glistening surfaces, the tasteful art, or the impeccable furnishings. All he could think about was the weight of what had just transpired in the lobby. The hotel had been nothing more than a backdrop. The real story was what happened inside him, in the quiet spaces where the world's judgment and his own response collided. Malcolm walked to the window, his reflection merging with the view of the city beyond. The city that never paused, a city where everyone was always moving forward, always striving to be seen. He couldn't help but gaze out at it, the streets full of people on their way to the next thing, on their way to success. But how many of them were just like him? How many of them were fighting for the same things, but without the luxury of recognition or even respect? This isn't just about the hotel, he thought, watching the world move beneath him. It's never been just about me. It's about something more. It's about showing the world that respect isn't a gift. It's earned. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled deeply. His gaze shifted to the bed in the corner, to the crisp white sheets he would never lie in. His mind was racing through the events of the day, replaying them over and over. The way the staff had dismissed him, the way Sophie's eyes had flicked away from him as if he were an inconvenience, and yet he remained calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out, despite the humiliation that burned inside him.
It wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But something had changed today. His quiet resolve wasn't born out of fear or submission. It wasn't born out of trying to make people like him, trying to convince them of his worth. No, this was different. The game had changed. Malcolm's thoughts drifted back to the years of being overlooked, of walking through life with the feeling of being invisible, of being underestimated by everyone who couldn't look past his skin or his youth. He could see his younger self now, the same intensity in his eyes, but without the experience to know how to channel it. It had been harder then. The world didn't want to make room for someone like him. He wasn't born into wealth, into access. No one handed him a seat at the table. He had to fight for every inch, prove his worth every day. In the beginning, he hadn't even known how to fight. There were moments, so many moments, when he was reduced to nothing more than a stereotype, a young black man with big ideas that no one took seriously. He had tried to push back, tried to show the world that he wasn't like everyone else, but he quickly learned that being different was dangerous. It made you a target, not a leader. I learned to keep my head down, Malcolm thought, the memories washing over him in waves. To wait for the right moment. But the world, it never gave me that moment. There had been the corporate meetings where his voice had been lost in the noise, where they spoke over him, assuming he had nothing to offer. He could still remember one meeting in particular. He had pitched a groundbreaking idea, one that had the potential to change everything. But when it came time for the big decision, his idea was dismissed. Not because it was bad, but because he didn't look like someone who could bring it to life. They were too busy listening to the white faces at the table, the people they were used to seeing in charge, the people they had always listened to. That day, he had smiled through the meeting, nodded through the rejection, but inside, his mind had been racing. Why wasn't his idea enough? Why was it always about his appearance, about what others expected from him, rather than about what he brought to the table?
I didn't come here to make them like me. I didn't come here to change their opinions of me. I came here to prove that I was worthy. I came here to show them that I could be better than what they thought of me. Malcolm leaned his palms against the cool glass of the window and took a long, slow breath. His heart was steady, but there was still a fire inside him, a hunger that had never quite been satisfied. The thing about being overlooked was that it didn't break you.
It just made you stronger. And the more he fought, the more he showed up, the more they had to recognize his worth. As he stood in the hotel room, the city lights flickering below, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that this battle, the one that was playing out in this very hotel, was the culmination of all the battles he had fought before. The rejection he had faced growing up, the dismissals in boardrooms, the times people assumed he wasn't good enough. But today, it was different. Today he was no longer just fighting to be seen. He was fighting for respect, and that was something no one could give him. He had to take it. The hotel, the staff, the guests, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that Malcolm Reed had faced far worse than their subtle dismissals. He had lived a life where he was told he didn't belong, and each time, he had found a way to belong anyway. Now, standing here in this hotel, he wasn't just another guest. He was the owner. And soon, everyone would know what that meant. Malcolm turned away from the window, walking toward the edge of the bed where his jacket lay. He sat down slowly, eyes still focused, but now reflecting inward, remembering just how far he had come. How many doors had been slammed in his face? How many meetings had been wasted by people who didn't even see him as worthy of being in the same room? But here he was. He had built his empire, and now he was ready to reclaim the dignity that had been stolen from him in every corner of his life.
He looked around the hotel room, his reflection catching in the glass once more. This moment was his. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for. The moments of humiliation had led him here, to this place where he no longer had to ask for respect. He would show them, not just because he could, but because he had earned it. "I'm not here to prove them wrong anymore," Malcolm whispered to himself. "I'm here to prove that I'm worthy, and they will see it. Every single one of them will see it." And as he stood up, the weight of his resolve settled over him, a quiet but powerful storm. Today wasn't about the hotel or Sophie or the staff. This was about him, and he was ready to take the world he had built, one moment at a time. The high-rise tower of Reed Global gleamed in the morning sun, its sleek, modern architecture cutting through the skyline like a silent promise. Malcolm Reed walked into the building with the same unshakable confidence that had defined his rise. He wasn't just a man in a suit anymore. He was the suit. He was the one whose name commanded respect, whose decisions shaped the future of industries, whose vision had transformed the very landscape of business. But he hadn't always been here. Years ago, Malcolm had been a different man. The face staring back at him in the mirror was no longer the same uncertain young man who had once walked into endless meetings, his palms sweating, his voice barely rising above a whisper. Back then, the boardrooms he stepped into had been filled with polished men in tailored suits, confident in their entitlement. They all had the answers before they even asked the questions. They were the mold of success, the prototype that society expected. But Malcolm didn't fit, and the world made sure to remind him of that. He remembered one early meeting in particular. The conference room was filled with a panel of high-powered executives, their eyes already made up, even before Malcolm had said a word. The subtle mockery in their expressions didn't escape him. The way they looked at him, like he didn't belong, like he wasn't worthy of being in the same space, let alone at the table. There had been the time the CEO of a major firm had patted him on the back, saying, "You've got a good head on your shoulders, son. Just remember, in this business, it's not what you know, it's who you know." Malcolm had smiled through it, though the words had stung like salt in an open wound.
He had fought to prove himself, to break through that invisible wall that always seemed to form whenever he stepped into a room of privilege. He was young, hungry, determined to make his mark. But those qualities weren't enough to overcome the skepticism that came with his skin, his age, his background. They think, I need their validation, he thought back then. But I don't. I'll show them what happens when you bet on me. And he did. It hadn't happened overnight. There were years of sacrifice, countless hours of struggling against the tide, learning from every failure, building something from the ground up. But in time, the world had no choice but to see him. Malcolm had worked tirelessly to make Reed Global what it was today. It started small, one project, one idea at a time. He had built his empire from nothing, no trust fund to fall back on, no family connections to leverage. He had to fight for every deal, prove himself with every contract, earn his place among the titans of industry. In his early years, Reed Global had been nothing more than an office above a small coffee shop, the hum of the espresso machine blending with the sound of his phone calls and papers shuffling. The space was small, cramped even, but it was his, every inch of it. Malcolm had spent countless hours drafting proposals, refining business strategies, learning from those who dismissed him, turning their doubts into the very fuel that powered his success. He often worked well into the early hours of the morning, his mind churning over numbers, projections, and possibilities. Nothing was left to chance. He knew that the world wouldn't give him anything. He would have to take it. And so he did, one step at a time.
It hadn't always been easy. In those early years, rejection was a constant companion. Deals fell through at the last minute, clients pulled back at the first sign of uncertainty. But every setback was fuel for Malcolm's drive. When he failed, he didn't let it define him. He just learned from it, adapted, and moved forward with a single-minded determination. As his company grew, so did his presence in the business world. Soon, Malcolm was no longer the underdog. He was leading the charge, and not just in the boardrooms of small-time deals, but at the tables of the largest corporations. He sat in executive meetings where decisions worth millions were made in the span of a few hours. He had earned his seat at the table, and it had never been handed to him. He had clawed his way up through every level of skepticism and doubt. But despite his growing influence, the respect he deserved was still never fully given. In every boardroom, in every meeting, there was always someone who would undermine him or question his authority, always someone who seemed to think they knew better. It wasn't always blatant. In fact, it rarely was. The subtle slights continued. The way eyes would glance away when he spoke, the way his ideas were sometimes passed over, only to be echoed by someone else moments later. There had been countless executive meetings where his ideas had been brushed aside, dismissed as though they were nothing more than flashes of brilliance that wouldn't last. Even when the numbers proved him right, even when the data was irrefutable, there were always those who tried to act like it was just luck, not vision. But now, he wasn't that young man anymore. Now, Malcolm Reed was someone no one could afford to ignore. His self-assurance was no longer born out of desperation, but out of proof. His empire wasn't just built on dreams, it was built on results.
He no longer worried about whether or not someone would take him seriously. He commanded it. His decisions had weight now, and people followed because they had to, not because he begged them to. He had learned that the only validation he needed was his own. And as he stood in the boardroom now, the top floor of his building gleaming behind him, he wasn't just another suit. He wasn't someone who had to earn his place anymore. He was the place. But that didn't mean the road had gotten easier. Respect was still something he had to demand, something he had to prove. Even now,
With his empire growing larger by the day, Malcolm could feel the lingering resistance, the little moments where people tried to remind him that he still wasn't quite enough in their eyes. And that was fine. That's what drove him. It always had. Every deal, every contract, every new venture wasn't just about expansion. It was about showing the world that the young man who was once overlooked was now the one in charge. The same man who had been reduced to nothing but a number, a statistic, was now the one who was setting the rules. Every success wasn't just a business win, it was a personal victory. The man he had once been, the one who was silently dismissed, was still there, buried beneath layers of success. But the difference now was that the world no longer defined him. I'm not here to prove them wrong, Malcolm thought. I'm here to prove that I belong, that I've always belonged. The sound of the front desk bell was the only break in the silence as Sophie Lang mechanically typed into her computer. Her fingers moved with the kind of practiced detachment that one might associate with a job that demanded nothing more than compliance. Her eyes flicked up briefly, scanning Malcolm's face, before turning her attention back to the screen, her expression settling into a mask of polite indifference.
But, in that moment, the dismissal was clear. Sophie had already decided who Malcolm was. The slightest twitch of her lip, the way her eyes quickly slid away from his, told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't looking at him as someone who mattered. To her, he was just another nameless guest, someone who didn't deserve her full attention, another customer to push through the system. As she handed him the keycard, the movement was slow, deliberate, as though she were doing him a favor, as though the key were something he should be grateful for. She handed it to him with the smallest hint of sarcasm, her voice slightly pitched as she said, "I hope you enjoy your stay, sir. If you need anything, just let us know, though I'm sure you'll be fine." The words hung in the air like a barely concealed jab. Sophie wasn't just dismissing him, she was subtly telling him that he wasn't her problem, that his presence here didn't matter. She wasn't even pretending to be helpful. There was no warmth in her tone, no genuine service in her words. The politeness was thin, fragile, covering up an unmistakable air of superiority. It was a feeling Malcolm had experienced countless times, the undercurrent of prejudice that wasn't loud, but was just as damaging as any overt insult. And then there was Harold Whitman, standing behind the desk with his arms crossed, observing the interaction with a look of barely disguised disdain. His eyes narrowed, following Malcolm's every movement, as though the mere presence of someone like him, someone dressed casually, someone who didn't belong in the world they had created, was an affront to his authority. As Sophie handed Malcolm the key, Harold barely acknowledged him with a curt nod. His eyes flicked over him, scanning Malcolm from head to toe like he was an inconvenience, a fly buzzing around his meticulously constructed world. There was something about the way Harold held his posture, his arms stiffly crossed, that conveyed a sense of superiority. He looked at Malcolm like he was an intruder in a space that wasn't meant for him, as though he had wandered into the wrong room, one reserved for people who knew their place. Every moment that passed made the tension more palpable, more noticeable. The way Sophie's lack of eye contact made Malcolm feel like an outsider. The way Harold's body language screamed discomfort, his stiff posture a silent signal that this was his space, and anyone who didn't belong would feel the weight of his contempt. It wasn't overt hostility. No, it was much worse. It was the subtle, insidious form of microaggressions that had followed Malcolm his entire life. They didn't shout. They didn't curse. They were delivered in a soft tone, a delicate smile, a gesture that wasn't quite as warm as it should have been. But it still hurt. And then Carl Benson entered the scene, and the atmosphere in the lobby shifted again, this time more dramatically.
His presence was like a physical force, his broad frame and slow, deliberate steps adding a sense of finality to the moment. He was the hotel's security guard, but today, he was the one who looked like he had been summoned to assert control. Carl moved in like a man accustomed to being in charge, his gaze never straying from Malcolm's face. As he approached, his eyes hardened, narrowing just slightly, his body tense, ready for confrontation. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a moment to size Malcolm up, looking him over as if he were a problem that needed fixing. His movements were calculated, slow and deliberate, designed to show that he was the one in control now, not Malcolm. Carl's hands rested on his hips, his chest puffed out slightly, as if to make himself appear larger in the space. There was a shift in his stance, a small but intentional movement meant to block Malcolm's path, to subtly assert his dominance in the situation.
Malcolm could feel the change in the air. It wasn't just the hotel staff anymore. It was Carl, a man who clearly thought he knew how to handle someone like Malcolm, someone who didn't know his place. Carl was the type of man who had been trained to keep order, to ensure that people like Malcolm didn't step out of line, didn't push back against the walls that had been carefully built around this world. He was the enforcer, the physical presence meant to remind everyone that the rules were not meant to be broken. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He stood his ground. His posture was still, his eyes never leaving Carl's. The growing tension in the air only made Malcolm more resolute. This was the test. This was where they would see if he would back down. And they were about to learn that he wouldn't. Carl's hand hovered near his walkie-talkie, his fingers almost caressing it like it was a tool of power, a reminder that he had the authority to end this with one call. He could escalate the situation, could easily assert his dominance. But he didn't move. Malcolm didn't budge. For a long moment, Carl simply stood there, his jaw clenching slightly as he stared Malcolm down. It was the kind of stare that tested you, one that dared you to react, to push back. But Malcolm was no stranger to this game. He had faced bigger obstacles, stronger forces. And this was just another moment, just another time to prove that his resolve was unshakable. Sophie and Harold watched, their eyes shifting from Carl to Malcolm, wondering what would happen next. The guests in the background, they had started to notice the growing tension. Some had stopped speaking altogether, their whispers silenced by the uncomfortable atmosphere that seemed to press down on them like a weight. Malcolm's calm demeanor was like a shield. The more they tried to push him, the more he pushed back with nothing more than his presence, his unwavering composure. He wasn't here to make a scene. He wasn't here to shout or demand respect. He was here to show them that he was worthy of being seen. And as the seconds stretched on, it was clear. The balance of power had shifted. This wasn't a battle that Carl, Sophie, or Harold could win. The power wasn't in physical force or dominance. It was in Malcolm's silence, his quiet resolve. And in that moment, they realized Malcolm wasn't the one who needed to prove himself. They were. They were the ones who would need to acknowledge him, because whether they liked it or not, he wasn't going anywhere. The lobby, once a picture of quiet luxury, now hummed with a barely contained energy. It wasn't just the soft clink of glasses or the distant sound of footsteps on marble. It was the shift in the air. The guests, once absorbed in their own conversations or their phones, now seemed to notice something different. The subtle tension between Malcolm and the hotel staff was becoming too palpable to ignore. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But it was unmistakable. Something had shifted.
The whispers began, soft at first, like a breeze ruffling the pages of a book, but growing louder as the tension mounted. Malcolm could hear them, but he didn't flinch. He never flinched. Their eyes moved from the desk to him, lingering just a bit too long, their expressions betraying the unease they felt, the discomfort they were trying so hard to hide. Malcolm's gaze remained steady, not looking at the staff or the guests around him, but straight ahead. He could sense their curiosity, the way their glances shifted between Sophie, Harold, and Carl, then back to him, trying to piece together what was happening. He could feel their eyes on him, those silent judgments. They always came, didn't they? The weighing, the measuring, the way people always tried to determine if someone like him really belonged in their world. But now, it wasn't just Malcolm they were looking at. They were looking at Sophie and Harold, too. They were watching the staff's reaction, waiting to see what would happen. And in doing so, they began to notice something that had been carefully hidden just beneath the surface. The treatment of Malcolm, the subtle way he was being marginalized. Malcolm's calmness was a direct contrast to the increasing discomfort of the staff. Sophie, still trying to pretend everything was normal, had begun to show the first signs of nervousness, her fingers tapping the edge of her desk more rapidly now, her movements a little more jittery. Harold's arms were still crossed, but his gaze had softened, no longer as dismissive, now replaced with the growing realization that something wasn't right. Carl, too, stood taller, his posture shifting from authoritative to more defensive, as if trying to brace himself for something he wasn't sure he could control. The guests began to feel it. Their whispers grew louder, more direct. Some were talking about the check-in process, questions about why it was taking so long, why the staff seemed so tense. Others were clearly discussing Malcolm's interaction with the staff. The power dynamics in the room were becoming more obvious, and the guests were beginning to pick up on it.
One by one, Malcolm felt their eyes shift toward him. He could feel their gazes, first just curious, then something deeper. Some guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure how to react to what they were witnessing. The hotel was supposed to be a place of graciousness, of refined manners, but here they were, watching the invisible boundaries of privilege being tested. Malcolm didn't need to see their faces to know what they were thinking. They don't know who I am, Malcolm thought, the realization settling in with a sharp clarity. But they're going to find out. There it was, the moment he had been waiting for. It wasn't just about the hotel or the staff or the keycard that had been handed to him with barely veiled disdain. This was bigger. This was about something that had been building in him for years, the fight for respect. It wasn't about being seen or heard in the usual sense. It was about taking what he was owed, what had been withheld from him all his life. And right now, in this hotel, in front of all these people, he was going to take it. He could feel the shift in tone around him. It wasn't a dramatic change, not yet, but it was there. He could sense the discomfort rippling through the guests as they felt the tension between him and the staff. Sophie's polite smile had faltered for just a second. Harold's posture had gone from defensive to uneasy, his gaze flitting between Malcolm and the other staff members. Carl was now fully aware that this wasn't going to go the way he thought it would. The control he once had over the situation was slipping, just as the guests in the lobby were realizing something wasn't right. Malcolm stood in the center of it all, calm, but inside, he was beginning to feel something shift within him. It wasn't rage, and it wasn't panic. It was certainty. He had been underestimated for so long. He was used to this dance, to being the one everyone thought they could push aside. But today, in this moment, he was going to turn the tables. His thoughts were quiet, but his resolve was clear. I've been dismissed too many times. I've been reduced to nothing because of who I am. Today, I don't wait for permission. I don't need to ask for respect. I'm taking it, right here, right now. As the whispers continued to circle around him, as the unease grew in the room, Malcolm remained unwavering. He could feel the shift in the air like the tension before a storm. The moment had come. He was no longer the one who had to prove himself. He was the one they would have to reckon with.
The room buzzed with expectation, and Malcolm let it build. He didn't flinch. He didn't shrink. The storm inside him was brewing, but he controlled it. He always had. In a place where everyone else was too afraid or polite to make a move, Malcolm was ready to take control. And with every second, the guests could feel it, the undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The hotel might have been their kingdom, but in this moment, it was his battleground. And the only question left was, what would they do next? The moment hung in the air like the stillness before a storm. The tension in the lobby thickened as the subtle microaggressions grew more pronounced. Guests were watching, whispers carried across the room like quiet ripples in a pond, and Sophie and Harold were now fully aware that this wasn't just a regular check-in. Malcolm's presence, his calm composure, had shifted the dynamic entirely. But for all the discomfort, he remained an enigma, silent, unbothered, waiting. But beneath the surface, something inside him was stirring. It wasn't anger. No, Malcolm had long since learned to contain his emotions. His anger was a tool, and tools were to be used strategically. What was stirring wasn't rage, but a quiet resolve, a sense of certainty that this moment would be his. It wasn't just about being seen or being acknowledged, it was about control, and he was going to take it, slowly, methodically. Sophie Lang's polite dismissiveness was beginning to irritate him, but his face didn't betray it. Instead, he noticed every small detail, every subtle slip in her composure. The way her hands shook just slightly when she handed him the key card, how her eyes flicked nervously around the lobby. She was starting to feel the pressure, and Malcolm noticed it. His mind was calculating, always several steps ahead. He didn't need to react now. That was what they expected. He would let the situation build, let them overplay their hand until he had the perfect opportunity to strike.
His body language, though seemingly at ease, was a deliberate exercise in control. Malcolm stood taller now, his posture straight, shoulders squared, but still relaxed, as though he were simply a guest in the lobby. But underneath the calm, he was testing the waters, measuring the atmosphere, waiting for the exact moment when everything would come to a head. There was a slight shift, something subtle but undeniable in the way he carried himself. His gaze hardened ever so slightly as he glanced at Harold, who still hovered in the background, arms crossed, a look of disdain lingering in his eyes. Harold was trying to project authority, trying to intimidate without saying a word, but Malcolm wasn't intimidated. If anything, he was studying Harold, watching for the slightest signs of weakness, the smallest opening. The guests, still watching the unfolding drama, were beginning to feel the undercurrent of tension. Malcolm could sense their discomfort. They weren't sure what was happening, but they were beginning to realize that the dynamics in the room were shifting. The power was slowly moving from the staff to Malcolm, even though no one had yet acknowledged it. The guests didn't need to see the details. They just knew the rules of this game were being rewritten. Sophie and Harold might have thought they were in control, but Malcolm was waiting. He wasn't going to act impulsively. He wasn't going to fall into their trap of reaction. He had spent years learning how to keep his composure, learning how to read situations just like this and wait for the right moment to streak. His resolve was becoming sharper, more focused. It wasn't a sudden outburst, not an immediate confrontation. Instead, it was the quiet building of confidence, the certainty that he would take control when the time was right. He was playing a long game, and the game was almost over.
As he stood there, the weight of the moment seemed to settle over him, like a heavy mantle he was preparing to bear. He could feel the subtle changes in the air, the way the guests had begun to hold their breath, unsure of what was about to happen, and he was ready. He wasn't going to be the one who pushed first. He didn't need to. He would simply wait for them to make the first mistake, and when they did, he would take what he had always deserved: respect. Malcolm's body language had shifted again, ever so slightly. He leaned forward just a touch, letting the room see that he was present, that he was aware, but he wasn't rushing. He wasn't moving hastily to confront them. Instead, he let them come to him. Every subtle shift in his posture, every calm breath, was designed to show them that he wasn't afraid of their hostility. He was waiting. Sophie had returned to her computer, typing quickly, trying to regain the control she had lost. But her fingers were twitching, a sign that her composure was starting to crack. She tried to act like nothing had changed, but the way she glanced over at Malcolm every few seconds told a different story. She was uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to handle it. Harold, standing off to the side, had become even more rigid, his posture stiffening, his jaw tight. He was trying to project authority, trying to show Malcolm that this was his space, but it was clear the confidence he was trying to mask was faltering. Every time he shot a glance at Malcolm, there was a hint of unease that he couldn't hide. Malcolm noticed it, of course. He noticed everything. And Carl was still standing by the door, his arms crossed, waiting for something. But what was it? What exactly was Carl waiting for? A sign of aggression? A reason to step in? Malcolm could feel the smallest shift in Carl's stance, the slight tension in his neck. Carl wasn't sure how to react either. The power dynamics in this room had shifted, and everyone felt it, but none of them knew how to handle it yet. And that's when it hit Malcolm. They were waiting for him to react.
But Malcolm didn't react. He was the one in control. And as the seconds dragged on, he let the moment build, let the room settle into that uncomfortable tension. He could feel it now, the building anticipation. The guests were watching closely now. Some of them were even glancing at each other, silently asking what would happen next. Others, noticing the way Malcolm remained unfazed, were beginning to feel the power shift in his favor. And yet, Malcolm remained still. He wasn't reacting to their hostility. He was preparing himself for what came next. This is the moment, he thought to himself, the words barely a whisper in his mind. This is what I've been preparing for. I'm going to take control. I'm going to turn this around. And as the staff, the guests, even Carl awaited the next move, Malcolm knew he had them exactly where he wanted them. The calm before the storm had reached its peak. They had tried to push him, tried to dismiss him, tried to make him feel small. But now, the time had come. They don't know who I am, Malcolm thought again. And this time, the realization hit with the force of 1,000 moments of humiliation, disrespect, and underestimation. But they're going to find out. And in that moment, he finally let himself feel the certainty of it all. He was going to take his place, without asking for permission. He was going to make them see. The time was near. Everything was about to change. The room was shifting, every second dragging the tension tighter and tighter. Malcolm Reed stood at the center of the storm, calm and poised, but the atmosphere around him had begun to swell with a new energy. It wasn't just the staff who felt the change now. The guests in the lobby, once casually engaged in their own conversations, now couldn't help but take notice. They couldn't help but watch. They weren't actively involved in the exchange, but their silent observation spoke volumes.
One by one,
The eyes of the guests slowly shifted from their smartphones, their drinks, and their conversation partners to Malcolm, and then to the staff. It wasn't just curiosity that drew their attention. It was something deeper, an almost magnetic pull to the growing discomfort in the air, to the undercurrent of power that was beginning to seep into the room. Some guests, perhaps unaware of what they were doing, began subtly recording the scene on their phones. The cameras were held low, almost discreetly, as if they feared the act of recording might draw attention to themselves. But the truth was that, like the others in the lobby, they were now part of the moment. They were witnesses, silent, passive, but undeniably involved. One woman in the corner, her fingers hovering above the screen of her phone, glanced nervously around, as though unsure whether to join in. But her curiosity won out. She pressed record, not just for herself, but for the story unfolding in front of her. Another guest, an older man in a sharp business suit, caught the woman's eye for a moment. Uncomfortable glances exchanged between them. Neither of them said a word, but the meaning was clear. They were witnesses to something bigger than a simple check-in. In another corner, a couple whispered amongst themselves, their voices lowering as the tension in the room continued to build. Their eyes flicked toward Sophie, whose nervous fidgeting behind the desk was becoming more and more apparent. The man, who was dressed in a custom-tailored suit, seemed to observe the situation with a degree of intrigue, his gaze now fixed firmly on Malcolm. The woman next to him, however, couldn't take her eyes off Harold. The way his arms were crossed, the way he stood stiffly, trying to regain his composure, seemed to signal to her a sense of unease, a hint that this situation was spiraling out of control in a way that couldn't be ignored.
And yet, none of them spoke out loud. None of the guests stepped forward to intervene. They were watching, yes, but they were still spectators in a story they hadn't been invited to participate in. Their role was passive, their awareness growing with each passing second as they sensed the shift in power. For Malcolm, this wasn't just another interaction with a staff member. This wasn't about the hotel or its keycard. This was a moment larger than him, and he knew it. Every passing second, every shift in the eyes of the guests carried weight far beyond the immediate exchange. The hotel lobby had become a theater, and he was now playing the lead role. The guests might not have realized it, but they were witnessing more than just a man checking in. They were witnessing the subtle dance of power that had played out countless times before, with the unequal distribution of respect always being the theme. This moment spoke to something deeper. How much power do you have when the world refuses to see you? How much do you have to fight to simply exist in the spaces they try to exclude you from? As the guests watched, some uncomfortable, others more fascinated by the drama unfolding in front of them, they became part of the story too, whether they wanted to or not. Their presence, their passivity, reflected a society that stood by and watched the struggle without ever intervening, without ever speaking up. They weren't actively participating in the hostility, but by their silence, they were complicit in the game of respect and power being played. For Malcolm, it wasn't just about taking on Sophie's condescension, or Harold's dismissive glances, or even Carl's silent challenge. It was about the broader idea that this wasn't just a personal fight. It was a symbolic one. He wasn't the first person to face this kind of subtle hostility, and he wouldn't be the last. But if he could take control of this moment, if he could shift the balance of power in front of these guests, then perhaps they would leave the hotel with more than just a tale of odd customer service. Maybe, just maybe,
They would carry with them the memory of how someone had finally challenged the rules they didn't even know they were playing by.
The guests, in their silence, became witnesses to something much bigger than a typical hotel transaction. There was a subtle tension between them and the staff. They were all part of the same dynamic, whether they chose to admit it or not. As they whispered among themselves and exchanged those uncomfortable glances, they were all acknowledging something they had avoided for so long: the underlying disparities in power. The way the hotel, its atmosphere, and even the staff treated Malcolm spoke volumes about the subtle prejudices that permeated every corner of society. For the guests, this was a moment where the world outside the hotel walls collided with the one they had always taken for granted. They weren't used to seeing power so visibly at play. Normally, it was hidden, dressed up in fine clothes or camouflaged by politeness. But here, in the lobby, it was exposed, raw and inescapable. Some guests, like the young woman filming the interaction, couldn't look away. She wasn't just recording a scene of escalating tension. She was witnessing a moment of revelation, one where the difference between dignity and humiliation played out before her eyes. What had begun as a simple transaction, a check-in, was rapidly evolving into something larger, something that would stay with her long after she left the hotel. Whether she acknowledged it or not, the situation had marked a shift in her perception. She had witnessed a fight not just for respect, but for recognition, for the simple right to exist on equal ground with those who had always had the privilege to take it for granted. But Malcolm didn't just recognize this shift. He was the one creating it. His every move, every shift in his body language, every calm breath he took, was a reminder to the room that he wasn't just passing through. He was remaking the rules.
As the guests continued to whisper, their eyes flicking between the staff and Malcolm, they began to sense it. Malcolm wasn't the one who needed to prove himself. It was the staff who would soon have to reckon with him. The guests were passively watching a moment in which power was being redistributed, and they were going to walk away understanding that the world they had always known, one where power and respect were given freely to some and denied to others, was about to be flipped on its head. And all of it was unfolding in real time before their eyes. But in that moment, Malcolm was not just a guest in the hotel. He was someone who would be remembered, someone who would make sure that his presence was undeniable. The guests, the staff, they would all learn that respect was not given, it was taken. The weight of the silence in the lobby was beginning to feel like something tangible. Guests shifted uneasily, glancing between each other and then back at the front desk. The subtle drama between Malcolm and the staff had been unfolding, and now it was reaching a point of no return. Sophie Lang's nervous gestures, the way her fingers tapped too quickly on her keyboard, her face flushed from the strain of the moment, everything was unraveling. Harold Whitman's posture, which had once been smug and confident, was now rigid, his crossed arms a clutch of insecurity. Carl Benson, standing guard at the door, no longer exuded the usual authority. Now he seemed like another figure in the room, his watchful eyes flickering from one staff member to another, unsure how this would play out. And Malcolm stood there, as calm and composed as ever, his gaze steady, not showing a hint of the turmoil that must have been boiling under the surface. The air in the hotel lobby had shifted, the weight of unspoken tension now hanging between Malcolm and the staff, thick and suffocating. The guests, still watching silently, could feel it, the unspoken realization that something was about to break.
It had been a long time since Malcolm had let anyone underestimate him.
A long time since he had let anyone doubt who he was or what he was capable of. But standing here, in the very heart of the Summit Crown Hotel, he could feel the moment coming. The moment when they would realize who he truly was. Not just the man in the gray jacket and sneakers, not just a guest, but someone who had the power to shape the world around him. Malcolm took a step forward, his movements deliberate, almost as though he were shifting the gravity of the room with each step. He could feel the eyes of the guests and the staff on him, but he didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. With quiet confidence, he spoke, his voice carrying through the room with an authority that seemed to echo even in the most polished space. "I'm not just here as a guest, Sophie." Sophie's fingers froze on the keyboard, her face blanched as she looked up at him, confusion written across her features. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Malcolm continued, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not just a paying customer, Harold." He shifted his attention toward Harold, whose face had begun to pale under the weight of the conversation. The walls, once so impenetrable, were beginning to crack. Malcolm's words were the hammer, and every word he spoke chipped away at the facade they had so carefully built around themselves. "This hotel, this operation, it's mine. Reed Global owns this hotel." The room seemed to grow smaller in that moment. The air stilled, as though everything in the hotel had stopped and turned its attention to Malcolm, now standing before them, like a man who had just revealed the truth of who he was. There was no dramatic flourish, no grand gesture. It was simply the calm, undeniable truth. Sophie's eyes widened as the realization began to dawn on her. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Harold, ever the skeptic, took a moment longer. His expression faltered, disbelief momentarily clouding his face. Carl stiffened, his posture adjusting as if he were being drawn into something far bigger than what he had expected. Malcolm didn't wait for them to process it. He didn't need their recognition or their apology. He had already taken control of the room, simply by stating the truth. And in that moment, the shift in power was palpable. The air became heavier, not with the weight of expectation, but with the weight of the truth, the undeniable, unspoken power of Malcolm's revelation. The staff, who had treated him as an inconsequential guest, now stood at a crossroads. Sophie Lang, who had once dismissed him with an air of superiority, now looked as though she had been struck dumb. Her eyes darted between Malcolm and the other staff members, and her carefully practiced smile fell away entirely. Her hands, still shaking, gripped the edge of the desk, but she couldn't seem to find the right words to apologize or explain. She had been exposed, and so had the system she worked within. She had tried to treat Malcolm as though he didn't belong here, but now the room was filled with the undeniable truth. He belonged more than anyone else in this space. Harold Whitman's disdain evaporated in an instant, replaced by a deep, suffocating realization that hit him like a ton of bricks. His mouth opened, but no words came. The same man he had mocked, the one he had treated like a minor annoyance, was now the one holding the power in the room. And just like that, the roles had reversed. Malcolm stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Harold's. There was no malice in his eyes, no anger or desire for retribution. There was simply the quiet understanding that the time of submission was over. "Harold," Malcolm said, his voice unwavering but firm, "you've failed as a manager. You've let your own assumptions guide you, and you've treated me with a level of disrespect that's inexcusable. That ends today."
For a split second, Harold opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words never came. The reality of what had just happened was too much for him to grasp. Malcolm took another step, his presence now commanding the attention of the entire room. He could feel the shift in the air, the silent tension that was building, waiting for someone to make a move. "You're fired," Malcolm said,
his voice cold, measured. "You'll pack up and leave immediately. And don't bother trying to explain. The decision's final." There it was, the calm conclusion. Harold was finished. There would be no more opportunity for him to redeem himself, no more chance to regain the control he had so arrogantly wielded over Malcolm. This wasn't about revenge, it was about ownership, about justice. And in this moment, Malcolm was the one who held all the cards. Harold didn't speak. He didn't protest. His eyes darted around the room, but his pride had evaporated, leaving him with nothing but the cold, harsh reality of the situation. He was silent, swallowed by his own humiliation. Malcolm had played this game with precision, and now it was over. The power had shifted, and no one could ignore it anymore. Through it all, Malcolm never flinched. He remained composed, never once letting the situation get to him. It wasn't just that he was unbothered, he was calm because he knew exactly who he was. He had earned the right to stand here, to make these decisions. And now the staff had been forced to recognize it. They had humiliated him. They had tried to dismiss him, to make him feel small, like he didn't belong. But they had miscalculated. The moment they underestimated him was the moment Malcolm Reed decided to take control. He didn't let the anger bubble to the surface, even though it was there. He didn't lash out. He simply took action. The humiliation he had once suffered was nothing compared to the power he held now, and he would never allow anyone to make him feel like he was less than they were.
Malcolm stood tall in the center of the room, his eyes steady, his presence unshakable. He hadn't just won. He had taken what was his by sheer force of will. And as he looked at the staff, at Harold, at Carl, and at Sophie, he knew they would never underestimate him again. The sound of the elevator doors sliding open echoed through the otherwise still lobby, the faint ding of the bell breaking the silence that had settled over the hotel. The moment felt almost cinematic, an unmistakable shift in the air as the doors parted and Malcolm Reed stepped into view once again. His presence seemed to pull the room's attention toward him, as though the world around him had simply paused to acknowledge his arrival. Malcolm didn't rush. He moved with a calm deliberation, each step purposeful, as if he were anchoring himself within the space. The soft click of his sneakers against the polished marble was a stark contrast to the pristine, high-end surroundings. The glistening marble floors, the gold-trimmed furniture, and the towering chandeliers that bathed the room in soft, luxurious light. Everything in this lobby spoke of wealth and status, of power that had always been inherited, passed down, never earned by someone like Malcolm. But Malcolm didn't belong to this world, not in the traditional sense. He wasn't wearing the expected designer suits, the tailored jackets that were meant to speak of prestige. No. He wore what he had worn before, a simple gray jacket, well-worn sneakers, and a black leather bag slung across his shoulder. It was understated, unassuming. It was everything that the world didn't expect of someone who held the power that Malcolm had acquired. And that was exactly the point.
As he walked through the lobby, the contrast between him and the hotel's opulence felt striking, jarring even. The polished luxury of the hotel seemed almost too pristine for someone like Malcolm to be walking through it as if he belonged. But he did belong. In fact, this hotel was now his. The key card Sophie had handed him earlier was a symbol of the power he held, not the other way around. He wasn't just another guest here. He was the one who controlled the space, and he was about to show them. The camera lingered on Malcolm's face as he moved. His expression was unreadable, calm, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet confidence, a certainty that seemed to fill the entire room. He wasn't here to prove himself anymore. The time for that was over. No, this moment wasn't about fighting for recognition. It was about taking what was already his. His eyes didn't flicker, didn't dart nervously from one guest to another. He walked with the kind of confidence that only someone who had fought for every inch could possess. Sophie Lang stood behind the front desk, the computer screen still glowing faintly as she typed away, her fingers moving quickly, almost automatically. She had tried to regain control of the situation, had convinced herself that everything would return to normal after Malcolm had left the first time. After all, what had just happened? She was just doing her job, wasn't she? She had no idea who he was. She hadn't even realized the weight of her own actions, the subtle ways she had dismissed him, until now. But now, as she looked up from the desk, the first thing that caught her eye was the familiar presence moving through the lobby once again. Her fingers froze mid-type, her gaze snapping up. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a mistake in perception, but as Malcolm's figure grew closer, it became undeniable. He was back. Her pulse quickened, and Sophie's face shifted, her confidence momentarily slipping. She wasn't prepared for this, not again, not after everything that had happened. For a moment, Sophie tried to maintain her composure. She straightened herself up, took a deep breath, but the realization hit her like a cold wave. She remembered. She had been dismissive. She had failed to recognize him. And now, he was standing here, walking toward her with the same calm confidence, the same unshakable presence. Sophie's heart skipped a beat, the dread rising as she realized exactly who this was. He wasn't just a guest in a hotel. He was the owner, the one whose influence extended far beyond this lobby, the one who would soon control everything.
The camera followed Sophie's reaction, slowly zooming in on her face, capturing the exact moment the realization set in. Her eyes flickered toward Malcolm, then back to her screen, her thoughts clearly trying to catch up with the growing panic in her chest. Her fingers trembled for a split second as she tried to regain control, but her expression never changed. It was as if she were frozen, stuck between a desire to look away and the knowledge that she couldn't. Malcolm continued toward her, and the world around him seemed to fall away. The sounds of the hotel, the murmurs from the guests, the subtle clinking of glasses, it all faded into the background. What mattered now was the undeniable fact that Malcolm had walked into this lobby once again. But this time, it wasn't a simple transaction, it was a declaration. The slow zoom on Sophie's face only deepened the sense of her realization. The corners of her mouth twitched in the faintest attempt at a smile, but it was gone before it fully formed. Her lips parted, but no words came. She was already too late. Her smile had been part of the act, part of the game, and now she was exposed for what she had done, for how she had treated him. Her mind raced, trying to recover, trying to find the right thing to say, the right way to salvage the situation, but she knew deep down that it was beyond repair. The truth was out, the power had shifted, and she had failed to recognize it in time. She had dismissed the man who now owned the hotel. Malcolm was no longer just a guest. He was the central force in this space, and Sophie had made the critical mistake of underestimating him.
As he approached the desk, the guests in the lobby watched in silence, their eyes now fully focused on Malcolm. It wasn't just Sophie's face that had changed. The entire room had shifted. The expectation in the air was palpable, and even the staff behind the desk seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what came next. Malcolm paused for a moment in front of Sophie, and for the first time since entering the hotel, he allowed his gaze to linger on her. His eyes weren't cold or vengeful. They were steady, measured, but there was a quiet understanding in them. He knew what had happened here. He knew that Sophie had dismissed him, tried to put him in a box he didn't fit. But that was over now. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but Malcolm raised a hand, silencing her before she could say a word. His calmness was a force, one that seemed to pull everything around him into place, steadily reorienting the room to his will. "I don't think we need to go through the pleasantries anymore, Sophie," Malcolm said, his voice firm but not harsh. "I've made my decision." Sophie stood there frozen, her eyes still wide in shock. The world had turned on its head. This was no longer a simple hotel interaction. This was a reckoning. Malcolm's calm words cut through the tension. "I'm not here for your apologies. I'm here to take control, and that means you're going to step aside." The camera lingered on Sophie's face as her realization fully settled in. The room seemed to shrink around her as Malcolm took his place at the center of the shifted dynamic. Sophie couldn't move, her mind trying to catch up with the speed of the transformation. She had underestimated him, and now the consequences were clear. Malcolm Reed had just reclaimed his power.
The lobby felt almost suffocating in its stillness. Every eye in the room was drawn to Malcolm Reed as he stood there, the center of an unfolding drama that no one had expected. The guests in the lobby watched, their gazes alternating between Malcolm and the staff, their whispers trailing off as the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. This wasn't just another guest standing at the front desk anymore. This was something bigger, something that was slowly becoming clear to everyone. Malcolm's eyes locked with Sophie Lang's. Her face still pale from the realization that she had made a grave mistake. She was frozen, standing there behind the desk, her hand hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. She had given him a key with the flick of her wrist. She had treated him like an inconvenience, but now it was clear he was far from that. He had held the room's attention for what felt like an eternity. The guests were no longer quietly watching, they were waiting for the next words to come, the truth that would upend everything they thought they knew. And then, as though the tension in the room had finally reached its breaking point, Malcolm spoke. His voice was calm, almost deceptively so, but it carried a weight that settled over the room like a storm cloud. "I'm not just a guest here," Malcolm said, his tone unwavering, each word hanging in the air with an unmistakable authority. "I'm the owner. It's under Reed."
The words landed like a thunderclap, shocking everyone into a sudden, profound silence. For a moment, it felt as if the room had paused, as if time itself had decided to hold its breath. Malcolm's identity was no longer in question. The man who had been so casually dismissed, the man who had been treated like any other guest, was now standing before them as the one who controlled it all. He was not just here by chance, but by right. The hotel was his. It had always been his. And the shocking realization rippled through the room. The camera cut to Harold Whitman, who was standing to the side of the desk. His frozen eyes stared at Malcolm with growing disbelief, his jaw slightly open as if he were trying to process the words he had just heard. His body stiffened, his usual confident stance suddenly betrayed by the sudden drop of his shoulders, as though his very sense of self had just been pulled out from under him. The camera lingered on Harold for a moment, zooming in on his face. His eyes darted to Sophie, then to Carl Benson, and finally back to Malcolm, as though searching for some kind of confirmation, some way to refute what had just been revealed. But the truth was undeniable. The color drained from his face, his hands trembling as they hovered near his side. He had tried to dismiss this man, tried to play his little game of superiority, but now it was clear. Harold had been playing with fire, and he had just burned himself. A bead of sweat began to form on Harold's forehead, a nervous tick betraying the storm of confusion and panic that was beginning to build inside him. His posture, once stiff and commanding, now felt small, almost deflated, as he stood there, utterly exposed. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to fix it. And then there was Carl Benson, standing near the door, his broad shoulders tense and his posture rigid. At first, Carl had been watching from the sidelines, trying to gauge the situation, but now that Malcolm had spoken, he was paralyzed. His usual assertive stance wavered. He couldn't hide his shock, and the realization hit him just as hard. The sweat on his brow began to trickle down as he processed what Malcolm had just revealed. He had been sizing Malcolm up, prepared to remove him if necessary. But now he had no idea what to do. The power had completely shifted.
The camera slowly zoomed in on Carl's face, capturing the unsettling recognition. The realization that the man who had been casually dismissed, the one they had tried to undermine and ignore, was the very person who owned the hotel. The slow blinking of Carl's eyes, the subtle shift in his stance, the tightness around his jaw. Every small reaction was a testament to the fact that he, too, had been caught completely off guard. The camera panned across the room, moving from Harold to Carl, and then to Sophie, who stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as if she were still trying to understand the magnitude of what Malcolm had just said. She could feel the weight of the moment, could feel the reality of her misjudgment crashing down on her. But there was no way to take it back now. She had treated him like just another guest, just another nobody. But now it was clear she was the one who didn't matter. And the shame of it hit her all at once. The camera then shifted to the guests, some of whom had been watching from a distance, the realization creeping over their faces as well. They had been silent witnesses, passive observers of a momentous shift in power, but they could no longer pretend this was just a minor incident. The tension in the room was now palpable, as everyone could feel the subtle but undeniable truth of what had just been revealed. Malcolm was no longer just a guest. He was the man who controlled everything in the room, and the staff, the guests, they had no choice but to confront that fact. Harold's shock wasn't just emotional, it was physical. His posture crumbled, his arms falling to his sides, as if the weight of the revelation had physically drained him. He had never expected this. He had dismissed Malcolm, had thought he could simply treat him like any other guest, that his position would remain unchallenged. But now, Harold was the one who had been dismissed. Malcolm owned him now, owned the very air in the room, and there was nothing Harold could do about it. Sophie, still standing frozen behind the desk, tried to find some semblance of words, but they caught in her throat. The realization had struck her, too, and she was no longer the confident receptionist she had been when Malcolm first arrived. She was a woman caught in the wake of a decision she didn't understand, one that had cost her more than just a job. Carl, still standing by the door, swallowed hard. His hands, which had been relaxed by his sides, now instinctively clenched into fists, his jaw tight as he looked at Malcolm. He was grappling with the shock of what had just been revealed. His position as security, his authority, had all been undermined in an instant. And now, the man who had once been a mere inconvenience to the staff was in control. The camera lingered on Carl's face, zooming in on the way his eyes widened, the deepening lines of confusion and fear slowly contorting his features. He had tried to hold his ground, to stand as if he was the one who dictated what happened in this space. But now, with the reality of Malcolm's revelation, he knew exactly who was in charge. The shift was undeniable. Malcolm had taken control without so much as raising his voice, without even moving a finger. It was all in his presence,
his ability to stand firm, unshaken, in the face of their dismissal. He had revealed his true identity, and in doing so, he had broken the illusion that the staff and the guests had so carefully constructed around him. As the camera lingered on the frozen expressions of Harold and Carl, the scene slowly came to a conclusion. Their postures sagged, their faces drained of color, and they both seemed to shrink under the weight of their own humiliation. They had been caught in their own game, and the rules had changed without them even realizing it.
The tension in the room hung thick, a heavy silence that only deepened with every second. It wasn't just the guests who were watching now. The staff were too, their eyes wide, the weight of Malcolm's revelation pressing down on them like a physical force. But there was one person left who hadn't yet grasped the full impact of the moment. One person who had been clutching to a sense of control that now, in an instant, was slipping from his grasp. Harold Whitman stood frozen in place, his body stiff as though he were trying to hold on to something, anything, to keep him anchored in this shifting space. He was a man used to authority, used to being the one who dictated the rules, who made the decisions. But right now, in the face of Malcolm's quiet power, he was anything but in control. His eyes darted between Malcolm, the desk, and the other staff members, as though he were trying to calculate his next move. But there were no moves left for Harold to make. Malcolm's words cut through the thick silence, their calm precision carrying a weight that Harold couldn't escape. The power in the room shifted, and Malcolm knew exactly what he was doing. His gaze was steady, unwavering, as he turned fully toward Harold. There was no anger in Malcolm's voice, no visible frustration, no rush of emotion, just cold, deliberate clarity. "Harold, you've lost your job." The words landed with deliberate force, each syllable echoing in the otherwise quiet space. "Your attitude isn't acceptable here."
The simplicity of the statement left no room for misinterpretation. Harold had been fired, and Malcolm wasn't asking for an explanation. He was stating a fact. For a moment, Harold seemed to freeze even further, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The shock on his face was unmistakable, as though the ground had been ripped from under him. He had been so sure, so confident, so used to being the one who handed out dismissals, that now, faced with his own, he couldn't find the words to speak. But the floodgates opened soon enough. Harold's voice cracked, and for the first time since entering the hotel, his composure began to break. He took a nervous step back, then another, stumbling over his own words, his mind racing to find something, anything, to save him from the inevitable. "Wait a second, I can explain," Harold stammered, his usual sharp tone replaced by an unmistakable tremor. I didn't mean any disrespect, He was trying to find his footing, to recover from the moment that had slapped him in the face. But it was clear. He was completely out of his depth now. No amount of explanation would undo what had already been said. Malcolm's presence was a quiet storm, and Harold couldn't weather it. Malcolm's calm demeanor didn't waver. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to show frustration. The power he wielded in this moment came from his control over himself and the situation. Malcolm didn't need to fight, he didn't need to argue, he didn't even need to raise his hand. His composure was enough to send Harold's confidence crumbling in an instant. Harold's hands, once crossed confidently over his chest, were now flailing nervously, twitching at his sides, as though he didn't know where to put them. Sweat dotted his forehead, a stark contrast to the usually pristine, composed manager standing behind the desk just moments ago.
His gaze darted from Malcolm's steady face to the floor, back to Malcolm again, like a man caught in a trap of his own making.
I didn't know, Harold continued, his voice rising in pitch. I didn't realize who you were. I would never have treated you that way if I had known. I thought you were just another guest. I didn't... He stammered, his words blending together in a jumble of excuses and panic. His attempt to apologize was desperate, and it only made his powerlessness more glaring. Every word he spoke seemed to land heavier on his shoulders. His face was turning from pale to red, the realization that he was not only wrong, but out of control settling in with crushing weight. Please, just give me a chance. I can fix this. I can do better. But his pleas were falling flat, like a man grasping at air. Malcolm stood still, his eyes steady, not a flicker of emotion in them. He wasn't reacting to Harold's scrambling defense, he was simply waiting for Harold to finish. But there was no doubt left. Harold had already lost. The moment had passed, and no amount of desperation would change that. Malcolm's calm, almost detached presence towered over Harold's broken defense. The more Harold flailed, the more Malcolm's unshaken composure seemed to amplify his failure. Every word from Harold seemed only to dig the hole deeper. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. He didn't need to. He simply watched as Harold fell apart, as the man who had once held so much power in the hotel was now reduced to an anxious, nervous wreck. Every attempt to explain himself, every word Harold spoke, only seemed to amplify his embarrassment. Malcolm was cool. His silence was a force, a reflection of the control he had over this moment. He didn't need to shout or scream. His presence alone was enough to take the wind out of his sails. It was power without movement, and it was clear to everyone in the room Malcolm owned this space now.
"There's nothing to fix, Harold," Malcolm finally said, his voice measured, cool, and firm. "You've shown me who you are, and now it's time to show you who I am." The words landed, cutting through the nervous energy that surrounded Harold like a blade. Harold was still trying to grasp at words, still trying to hold on to some shred of the authority he had once wielded so carelessly. But the truth was, there was nothing left for him to say. The decision had been made. Malcolm had spoken. Sophie, who had been standing silently at her desk, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and shame, seemed to shrink back. The power had shifted, and she too had become an unwilling witness to the unraveling of everything she had thought she knew about who was in control in this space. Malcolm's gaze turned to her for just a moment. There was no malice in it, only the quiet acknowledgement that this was the moment when the rules were rewritten. Harold's fate had already been sealed. Harold was still flailing, still trying to salvage his position, but there was no getting out of this. The reality of his mistake had become unavoidable, and he knew it. His eyes were glassy, his voice breaking with every word, and his hands were now at his sides, almost limp, like he no longer had the strength to hold himself together. "I'm sorry, I'm really sorry," he whispered, but it was too late. Malcolm's calm, firm gaze never wavered as he looked Harold in the eye one last time. "It's over, Harold. You're done here." With those words, the finality of the moment settled in. Malcolm turned without another word, his calm demeanor never changing. He didn't need to explain anything further. He had already taken control.
And Harold? He was left standing, alone in the lobby, the realization of his own failure crushing him with every passing second. His reign of superiority had ended. Malcolm had spoken, and the room, the hotel, and the world he thought he controlled had already moved on. The atmosphere in the lobby was now charged, thick with a tension that wasn't just felt, but seen. Every single person in the room was standing at the edge of something momentous. Harold Whitman was still rooted to the spot, his face flushed with the crushing weight of realization, the faintest quiver of defeat lingering in his stance. He was defeated not because of a grand outburst, not because of a heated argument, but because Malcolm Reed had taken control with a quiet, deliberate certainty that left no room for doubt. Malcolm's face, however, remained unchanged. His expression wasn't one of victory, nor was it one of anger. It was simply calm, a serenity that contrasted with the disarray surrounding him. It wasn't gloating, it wasn't triumphalism, it wasn't vindication. It was the satisfaction of knowing that in this moment he had done exactly what he set out to do. He had taken control. As Harold stood there, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, Malcolm didn't revel in his downfall. Instead, he simply watched the scene unfold with an unwavering calm. There was no celebration in his movements, no satisfaction in the demolition of Harold's pride. Malcolm didn't need to shout, he didn't need to humiliate, because in the quiet of his presence, in the strength of his composure, the power had already shifted. The battle had been won not in the loudest moments, but in the most silent ones. Malcolm's steps were measured, deliberate as he turned to leave the desk area. There was no need to look back. He knew the staff was watching, they were all watching, and he didn't need to see their disbelief or their shame written across their faces to feel the impact of his actions. He could feel it in the air, the change that had settled in the space around him.
Sophie, once so confident in her dismissive actions, now stood frozen. Her hands were still gripping the edge of the desk, but now they seemed almost lifeless, as though her body had been drained of the arrogance that had powered her earlier actions. There was no explanation she could give for what had just happened, no justification. The reality had set in. She had misjudged Malcolm completely, and the cost of that was now clear. Carl Benson, who had stood at the door as if ready to enforce order, now appeared like a man caught in the headlights of an oncoming car. His posture, once dominant and unyielding, was now filled with a subtle hesitation, a slight loosening of his shoulders, as if the authority he had once thought he held had been ripped away in a heartbeat. He stood there, silent, watching Malcolm leave, unsure of whether to speak, unsure of what to say at all. Carl had failed, and he knew it. But it wasn't a failure born of a single moment. It was a failure that had been building since the very first time he had underestimated Malcolm. And Malcolm? He walked forward, moving with a calm that seemed almost unnatural, his steps firm, assured. There was no triumph in his stride, no sign of the satisfaction that others would have shown. No, Malcolm was beyond all of that. The game had been played, the power was his, and he had no need to shout it from the rooftops. The subtlety of his control was far more powerful than any boastful display could ever be. As he moved through the lobby, he noticed the guests, the same guests who had been passive witnesses just moments before, still watching him. Their glances were no longer curious. They weren't simply observers anymore. They had seen the shift. They had watched Malcolm take charge without even raising his voice. And now, they were left to process what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a hotel issue. It was a lesson in power and respect. They saw now that power wasn't about shouting or throwing weight around. It was about taking control when others thought they held it.
Malcolm's movement through the space was almost serene, a quiet assertion of dominance that didn't need to be loud to be felt. As he passed by the guests, there was no glance exchanged with them. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need their recognition.
He owned the space with nothing more than his presence. Sophie's eyes followed him as he walked by, and for the briefest moment she opened her mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. She had made her mistake, and it had cost her far more than she could have ever imagined. Harold, still frozen by the desk, didn't move. The sound of his own breaths seemed too loud in his ears as the reality of his humiliation settled deeper. The quiet defeat in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew he was beaten, but worse, he knew that he had been the one who had brought it upon himself. The staff could see it, and the guests could feel it too. Harold's moment of power had passed in an instant, reduced to nothing more than the memory of his arrogance. For Malcolm, the satisfaction was not in their defeat, it was in the quiet, deliberate restoration of balance. He wasn't here to exact vengeance, nor was he here to make anyone feel small. He was here to show them that respect is not given, it's earned. And he had earned it. In this moment, Malcolm's satisfaction came not from the fireworks of confrontation, but from the certainty that he had reclaimed control of the space, the power, and the narrative. He didn't need to shout or boast. He had already made his point. And it was a point that would resonate long after the room had emptied. The way the staff stared at him, the way they slowly realized what had just happened, was all the confirmation he needed. There was no need for victory speeches, no grand declarations. The power was in the quiet, in the unspoken certainty that he had taken charge of his own narrative. The change was complete, and Malcolm knew it. By the time Malcolm exited the lobby, the silence that followed him out the door felt heavy, but it was not an oppressive silence. It was a silence that spoke of unanswered questions, of unspoken realizations settling in, and of a power shift that couldn't be ignored. The guests, now looking at the staff with a new perspective, could feel it too. The weight of the transformation in the room was palpable, and they would carry that weight with them, silent witnesses to the quiet storm that had just passed through the hotel. Malcolm didn't need to gloat. He never had to. His satisfaction lay in knowing that the fight was over, that he had stepped into his rightful place with the kind of power that didn't need to be proclaimed. It was simply known. And as the doors to the hotel slid open and Malcolm stepped out, he left behind a place that would never be the same. He had taken control, not by force, but by quiet determination, and that kind of power would resonate long after the lobby had emptied. The hotel lobby, now quiet in the aftermath of his departure, felt like a place caught between worlds, the old world of unchecked arrogance and power, and the new world Malcolm had just created. As he walked away from the Summit Crown Hotel, his steps remained steady, though inside, a quiet storm of thoughts churned. Malcolm Reed didn't need to rush. He never had to. He had already won, but the significance of it, the weight of the power he had reclaimed, the balance he had restored, was settling deeper inside him with each passing moment. What had begun as a simple visit to a hotel, a place where he had been dismissed, belittled, and treated as an inconvenience, had turned into something much bigger. A battle had been fought, not with words or violence, but with silent resolve, a display of self-possession that had ultimately upended the power dynamic in that room. This wasn't just about me, he thought to himself, the thought taking root in his mind. It's about everyone who's ever been overlooked, everyone who's ever been told they don't matter. This was never about a single hotel room or a key card. This was a statement, and I made it.
He had watched, without flinching, as the staff had tried to dismiss him, as they had worked to make him feel insignificant. But now, the power wasn't in their hands. It had never been about revenge. It had never been about showing the staff their mistake, or putting them in their place for the sake of their egos. No, for Malcolm, it had been about something far more important. It had been about taking his seat in a world that had long denied him. He had seen the cracks in the way people were treated,
And today, he had shown them just how easy it was to turn the tables when someone finally took charge. "I didn't just change their day," Malcolm mused as he walked, a slow smile playing at the edge of his lips. "I changed the way they see things, and that will last much longer than anything else." The news didn't take long to spread. Within hours, the story of the events at the Summit Crown Hotel had gone viral, circulating across news outlets, blogs, and social media platforms. Malcolm's quiet, decisive action had become the topic of conversation everywhere. His identity as the owner of the hotel had stunned everyone, but it was the way he had handled the situation that truly captured the public's attention. The announcement came the following day, broadcast across every major news channel. "Reform at Summit Crown Hotel, a new era of respect and accountability." The camera panned to a press conference held by the hotel's executive team, including David Whitaker, the CEO, and several high-ranking members of the hotel's board. There, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The usual air of polish and luxury that the hotel exuded had now been replaced by a sense of humility and even a hint of discomfort as the team faced the media. David Whitaker stood at the podium, his face serious, his usual corporate mask slipping. The apology he gave was unlike any corporate apology before it, genuine. His words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the mistakes made and the broken trust that had occurred within the organization.
As many of you know, Summit Crown Hotel has always prided itself on excellence and customer service. But recent events have shown us that we failed to live up to that ideal, David began, his voice measured but filled with an unmistakable sincerity. We allowed an environment where disrespect, subtle or otherwise, was allowed to thrive. We have come to the conclusion that this can no longer be the case. We are committed to reforming our practices, ensuring that every guest, no matter their background, is treated with the utmost respect. The camera panned to the crowd, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, and viewers at home nodding in approval. For the first time in a long time, the public reaction to a corporate decision was positive. People were glad to see change taking place, but more than that, they saw accountability. The staff's dismissal of Malcolm had been a wake-up call for an industry that had long operated under the belief that wealth and status gave them the right to treat others however they pleased. The ripple effect of the firing spread quickly through the hotel's corporate structure. It wasn't just the symbolic firing of Harold Whitman, the hotel manager. It was the beginning of a much larger change. The policy changes were soon announced, with a pledge to overhaul how guests and employees were treated. New training programs on diversity, equity, and respect were implemented across all levels of staff, and a zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination in any form was immediately put into effect. But the ripple didn't stop there. Industry-wide, the firing of Harold became the talk of the town, a pivotal moment that would set a new standard for corporate responsibility. The hospitality industry, often criticized for its hierarchical structures and elitist attitudes, was being forced to reevaluate itself.
Guests who had once been victims of similar mistreatment began to speak out, sharing their own stories of subtle discrimination they had faced in various hotels. The conversation around how employees should treat guests, regardless of their background, wealth, or appearance, was gaining momentum. Malcolm's quiet but powerful act of defiance had ignited a spark, and the flame was spreading fast. Amidst all the public reactions, one voice stood above the rest, the voice of David Whitaker, the CEO of Summit Crown Hotel. His apology had been both candid and heartfelt, a rare admission of failure in an industry that often preferred to bury such mistakes. But it wasn't just the apology that people focused on, it was the action that followed it.
I personally extend my deepest apologies to Mr. Reed and to every guest who has been made to feel lesser or unimportant in our establishment," David had said, his eyes locking with the cameras. "We failed to honor the trust that you place in us as a brand. We are taking immediate steps to correct this. I have already instructed our leadership team to begin the process of integrating a new culture of respect, and we will be monitoring the progress closely. This isn't just about fixing a bad experience, it's about making sure that this never happens again." David's sincerity was palpable. For once, the corporate world had seen something rare: accountability. He wasn't making excuses or pointing fingers. He wasn't trying to shift the blame. He was standing there, owning up to the fact that his organization had allowed disrespect to flourish under its roof. And now he was doing everything in his power to set it right. As the days passed, Malcolm Reed didn't bask in the public praise that flowed his way. He wasn't interested in headlines or interviews. He never had been. He didn't need to hear his name spoken with reverence or have the world shower him with accolades. The satisfaction he felt was far deeper. It wasn't about proving a point to the hotel staff or to the public. It wasn't about being right or even vindicated.
It was about something much more profound: change. True change. Not the kind that comes with loud proclamations or grand speeches, but the kind that begins with a single act of courage and reverberates outward, slowly but steadily altering everything in its wake. Malcolm had taken control of the narrative, and in doing so, had set the stage for something bigger than anyone could have anticipated. The reforms David Whitaker had announced weren't just cosmetic. They were a direct response to the pressure that had been applied in the wake of Malcolm's quiet but definitive action. For Malcolm, that was the real victory. The world was finally starting to recognize that respect had to be earned by everyone, and that those who overlooked that would no longer be tolerated, not by him, and certainly not by the public. The soft glow of the city lights outside his hotel room window painted the walls with shades of gold and amber, casting a tranquil light over the space. Malcolm Reed stood near the window, his back to the world outside, looking down at the bustling city below. From this height, everything seemed so small, insignificant almost. But inside his mind, the events of the last few hours felt like a storm that was still simmering, waiting to reveal its full impact. He had achieved what he came here for. Control had been restored. The dismissal of Harold Whitman was just the beginning, the symbolic first step towards something larger, something much more profound. But Malcolm knew better than to believe that this single act of defiance would be enough. No, the truth was far more complex. The issue of respect, of power imbalance, wasn't something that could be solved in one fell swoop. It ran deeper, threaded through every layer of society, woven into the fabric of industries, corporations, and individuals who thought their privilege was absolute. This hotel was just the beginning, Malcolm thought as he gazed out the window, his reflection barely visible in the glass. But it's a start, and the start is the most important part. Now the real work begins.
He could already feel the weight of it, the weight of the work ahead. It wasn't just about this one hotel, or even just this one incident. This was about the systemic issues that had festered for too long. The sense of entitlement and disrespect was deep-rooted. It wasn't something you could fix with a single act of power. No, this was about shifting an entire mindset. It was about showing people that you didn't have to shout or demand respect for it to be given. You simply had to take it, and then make sure that the systems around you recognized it. Malcolm's mind wandered to the bigger picture, the industry that had enabled this type of behavior. The hospitality industry, built on luxury, refinement, and customer service, but so often lacking in respect for the very people who helped keep it running. He thought of the countless other hotels, corporations, and industries that operated in similar ways, treating guests like commodities, making assumptions about people based on appearances, status, or wealth. They think they can continue this way forever, he mused, the fire of resolve kindling in his chest again. But I'm here to show them that I'm not just a guest in their world, I'm here to change it. He turned away from the window and walked over to the desk, pulling out a stack of papers and files, plans, ideas, drafts of new policies. This was where the real work was happening. He had already begun organizing the Dignity First initiative, a detailed plan to overhaul not just the hotel's operations, but the way the industry would handle issues of equality, respect, and diversity moving forward. But this wasn't going to be a quick fix. Systemic change took time, effort, and the will to endure the pushback, and Malcolm was ready for it.
As he sifted through the papers, his mind wandered again, this time to the guests, the people who'd come into the hotel unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors. Many of them had witnessed what happened in the lobby. Some of them had taken out their phones, recording the moment, sharing it with the world. And now they were talking about it, engaging in a wider conversation that had begun to build momentum. It was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been treated as lesser, everyone who had ever faced the subtle humiliations, the disrespect that often went unspoken. Malcolm could see it now, the beginning of change. But it wasn't over. This wasn't the end. It was merely the opening of a new chapter. He couldn't let this moment slip into the background of headlines, of social media trends that would soon fade away. No, this moment needed to be the foundation of something lasting. The following day, the press conference captured the attention of everyone. The Dignity First initiative had been officially announced, and it was clear that this was only the beginning. Malcolm, along with David Whitaker, the CEO of Summit Crown Hotel, stood at the podium. The crowd of reporters, guests, and staff members was mixed. Some still processing what had happened, others eager for the details of the reform. David Whitaker's voice carried through the microphone with grave sincerity, but it was Malcolm's words that left the most impact. He spoke slowly, deliberately, every syllable infused with purpose, as though he had already anticipated every question, every doubt. The Dignity First initiative is a comprehensive overhaul of how we, as an organization, approach every aspect of hospitality, Malcolm said, his voice steady, unwavering. From the front desk to the management offices, from our customers to our staff, we are committed to a new standard of equality and respect. We've seen what happens when respect is taken for granted, and we are committed to never allowing that to happen again. He paused, letting the words settle in. The media, the guests, and even the staff at the back of the room were listening intently. This wasn't a typical corporate spiel. This was change in action.
Effective immediately, Malcolm continued, Summit Crown Hotel will implement a strict policy of zero tolerance for any form of discrimination or disrespect, whether it's based on race, gender, socioeconomic status, or appearance. Every guest who walks through these doors will be treated with dignity, no exceptions. We are setting a new standard for what true hospitality means. The announcement was bold, a clear message that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a turning point for the entire hotel and beyond. But Malcolm didn't stop there. He wasn't just announcing policies, he was reshaping the way people thought about power and respect. "We are not just changing how we operate internally," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that sent ripples through the room. "We are changing the entire conversation around what it means to treat people with dignity. This initiative will expand beyond these walls, and I intend to make sure it influences the industry at large. This is the future of hospitality. This is the beginning of a new standard." The reporters in the room reacted, scribbling notes, snapping photos, raising their hands to ask questions. But they were met with Malcolm's unwavering composure. He didn't need to defend his stance. The strength of his words had already done that. Following the press release, Malcolm's message continued to resonate with both the public and employees alike. The impact of the Dignity First initiative became evident through a series of testimonials from both guests and staff members who had experienced the change firsthand. One former guest, a woman named Andrea Miller, appeared in a short video that circulated online. She spoke with tears in her eyes, recounting a past visit to Summit Crown where she had been treated dismissively by staff simply because she didn't fit the hotel's ideal guest profile.
"I didn't know it then, but now I do. I wasn't just treated poorly because of the service. I was treated poorly because of who I was, where I came from, and how I looked," Andrea said, looking directly into the camera. "To see that this hotel is making these changes, it's not just good for guests like me, it's good for the world. It's a sign that things can be better." Then there was John McAllister, a bellman at Summit Crown who had worked at the hotel for over a decade. In an interview, he spoke about how the new policies had made him feel valued in a way he never had before. "For the first time in my career, I feel like I matter," John said. "It's not just about the guests anymore. It's about the staff, too. The company used to think they could get away with treating people poorly, but Malcolm Reed has made it clear that respect isn't a one-way street. It's something we all deserve. It's what we've always deserved." The ripple effect was undeniable. Malcolm's push for change had begun to touch people at every level, making them feel seen, heard, and valued. His approach wasn't about punishing the past, it was about building a future where everyone could walk through the doors with their heads held high, knowing that they would be treated with the respect they deserved. The Dignity First initiative had only just begun, but it was clear that Malcolm's vision was already reshaping the way the hospitality industry would look moving forward. The reforms were only the first step in his larger plan, a plan that would not stop with this hotel, but would spread across the industry like wildfire. The change had already started, and Malcolm knew that as the world watched, as the guests and staff at Summit Crown Hotel began to embrace the new policies, the ripple effect of this moment would change everything. Malcolm stood back from the podium, his gaze sweeping across the room. This was just the beginning. The world was listening now, and he was going to make sure they wouldn't forget the lesson he had taught them. The fight for respect was far from over, but Malcolm was ready for whatever came next. He had already won the first battle, and now he was preparing for the wars to come. The world outside Summit Crown Hotel buzzed with energy, the news of Malcolm Reed's groundbreaking reforms echoing far beyond the confines of the hotel lobby. As the press release detailing the Dignity First initiative flooded social media, it became clear Malcolm had struck a nerve. The reactions came fast, furious, and filled with a sense of inevitability.
Across Twitter, Instagram, and news outlets, hashtags like Dignity First and Respect for All began to trend. The hashtags weren't just about a hotel, they were about a larger shift, one that felt personal to thousands of people who had, for too long, been brushed aside in all walks of life.
Malcolm's words had reached into the hearts of the public and stirred something that had been buried for far too long. On Twitter, the buzz was immediate. @Malcolm Reed is doing what so many companies refuse to do, putting respect for every individual above profits. #Dignity First. I was treated like trash at a hotel once, never spoke up. I wish someone like @Malcolm Reed was there when I was a guest. Proud to support #Dignity First. The tweets came in rapid succession, from regular citizens to public figures, all sharing their own stories of disrespect in environments like the one Malcolm had just transformed. A sense of solidarity spread like wildfire, as people saw their experiences reflected in Malcolm's actions. His ability to challenge a system of power and prejudice had ignited a conversation that could not be silenced. For every supporter, however, there were those who tried to downplay his actions, those who felt threatened by the idea of genuine change. As expected, not everyone was on board. There was a faction of the public that resisted the change, unwilling to accept that such deep-rooted disrespect could simply be addressed by a public apology or corporate reform. Many saw Malcolm's actions as a token gesture, an attempt to appease the masses, rather than a real shift in how things had always been done.
Just another CEO trying to play hero. Does anyone think a press release is going to solve deep-rooted issues of entitlement in this industry? #Dignity First is just corporate fluff. A few vocal detractors on social media attempted to discredit Malcolm's methods, questioning whether the Dignity First initiative was more of a public relations move than an actual cultural transformation. They downplayed the significance of his reforms, claiming that words alone couldn't change years of corporate culture. But for every critic trying to minimize the movement, there were dozens more praising it. The balance had already shifted, and the conversation Malcolm started would not be stopped by a few detractors. People began to realize that change was happening, not just for Malcolm, but for everyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or ignored in similar ways. Then came the most unexpected moment of all. David Whitaker, the CEO of Summit Crown Hotel, took to social media to offer a personal apology, not just for the hotel's past mistakes, but for his own role in allowing them to happen. In a short video shared across the company's official platforms, Whitaker looked directly into the camera, his face serious, his voice filled with the weight of sincere reflection. To our guests, to our employees, and especially to Mr. Malcolm Reed, I want to take a moment to publicly apologize for the disrespect that was allowed to happen at Summit Crown Hotel. I was wrong to dismiss the culture that led to this incident. I was wrong to think that we could maintain our success without truly valuing every person who walks through our doors. I am personally committed to seeing the Dignity First initiative through. We are going to change, and we will make sure this never happens again.
It was a moment of transformation, not just for Whitaker, but for the industry itself. The apology felt genuine, unlike many corporate apologies that are offered as a mere formality. Whitaker didn't hide behind corporate jargon. He admitted his mistake and took responsibility for it. The message was clear. Real change was coming. The final moments of the story played out with an almost poetic resonance. Malcolm stood at the threshold of the Summit Crown Hotel once again. His steps were calm, measured, but there was something different now. The weight of the moment had changed him. Not that it was evident in his appearance or demeanor. On the surface, Malcolm Reed remained the same. But as he walked through the hotel lobby, he felt the world around him adjust. The dynamics had shifted. And he knew it. He didn't need to look back at the staff or the guests. He didn't need their approval. He had already taken his seat at the head of the table. Sophie Lang was there, standing behind the front desk. She caught sight of him as he approached, and for the first time since their first meeting, there was no mockery in her eyes. Instead, there was something else. A respect she had never shown before. Her face, once smug, now softened. And as Malcolm passed, she gave him a small but genuine nod. The respect was earned, not because of his words, but because of his actions. He had taken control. Carl Benson was at the entrance, his posture no longer rigid, but instead relaxed, almost as if he had acknowledged the shift in power. He straightened up as Malcolm walked past, his face unreadable, but the silent understanding between them was clear.
The guests in the lobby, many of whom had witnessed the earlier confrontation, now glanced at Malcolm with a different eye. No longer was he just a man in a gray jacket and sneakers. Now, he was the man who had remade the rules. There was an almost reverent quiet as he moved through the space. He didn't need to make a statement with grand gestures. His mere presence spoke louder than any words ever could. And as Malcolm made his way through the lobby, he noticed the subtle changes that had already begun to take root. It wasn't just the staff who had adjusted. The guests, once distant and distracted, were now quietly acknowledging him with nods of recognition. There was no more condescension. There was no more subtle dismissal. Instead, there was an acknowledgement of the power he had seized, not through loud proclamations, but through quiet, deliberate action. Malcolm walked forward, his eyes scanning the lobby one last time. This place, which had once been a symbol of exclusion, now held a promise of inclusion. He had done what others thought impossible. He had shown that respect was something you didn't ask for. It was something you took. He reached the doors of the hotel, pausing just before stepping out into the bustling city. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to take it all in. The weight of the accomplishment, the sense that this was only the beginning of something much larger. And with that, he walked out, not with the burden of humiliation, but with the satisfaction of having achieved something lasting. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the beginning of a movement. And Malcolm Reed was at the helm.